Okay, colleagues, comrades. EMAR has been organizing seminars many years, and we have done 32 seminars and 2 meetings, 34 seminars, but then COVID came and there was an abrupt stop. And it's almost 3 years now. We are organizing now the first person-to-person, face-to-face seminar after that COVID pandemic. And we are planning to have at least 6 more until the summer, then continue as usual. Now, my comrade Ali is going to manage the meeting, and word is hers.
Thank you, Ismail. All welcome. After 3 difficult years, we are the survivors of quite harmful pandemic, and many of us suffered very deeply. And today I'm going I'd like to start with 3 subjects I'd like to talk about it. First one is topics of the seminars, some suggestions. Clash of imperialism from the Middle East to Ukraine. This is one suggestion. Second suggestion, left-wing progressive wave in Latin America. China as a new global superpower, rising star of 21st century. Well, the name of the topic, it doesn't mean we are thinking about it the same way. Global system, neoliberalism and power, political economy, context of dollar and dollar hegemony. Can the capitalist system deliver environmental justice? Rise of right-wing populism from Turkey to Hungary, Sweden, Thailand. And the last suggestion, global power is shifting, but where? What kind of world is emerging? These are the main topics we are suggesting, but if you have any other ideas, you can say now or later. Let us, EMAR, know about it. And each seminar, different people preparing the seminars, and after listening to the person, and we are keeping some time for questions and contributions. And the second subject I'd like to make, announcement. 28th of January, which is tomorrow, isn't it?
Yeah.
103rd anniversary of 15 Communist Party leaders who came to Turkey, joined the Liberation War, and they've been killed. And we are thinking about them. We are still, our hearts are hurting because of the way they face 15 young men who wants to do their best for their country. And the second item I would like to talk about is, again, is a very hurtful anniversary, is our comrade. Maybe you remember him from the meetings, İsmail Kaygusuz. Yeah. He always sitting over there. And last year, 3rd of February, we lost him. He left very valuable articles, books. How many books?
30.
No, 30 books. not only about Alevi culture and philosophy, but other type of topics as well. He himself an archaeologist, and also translating old Roman Empire languages to our language. Wonderful information he reached and let us know about it. His website is still open for anybody for making research about this type of subjects. These are the things I talk. Any question? No? Then, Nick.
Thank you.
Stage is yours.
Oh, great stuff. How long have I got? Could go on for an hour, but that's maybe a bit too long.
1 hour and 10 minutes.
I'll try and keep it less than that. So this is called Geopolitical Conflict and the Logic of Capital. I'll try and explain what I mean by that. So this was the abstract, which how should Marxists understand the relationship between the economic base of capitalist accumulation and the superstructure of the international system of states. Is conflict between major powers reasserts itself as Lenin's attempt to answer the same question, as I'm suggesting, amid the carnage of the First World War, when imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, in 1916, returned explanatory power for our day. What is the wider significance of war in Ukraine and the emerging Cold War, hopefully for the time being it stays a Cold War, between the United States and China, and what should be the political response of socialists, of us in effect, to all of this. So I'm hoping to initiate a discussion. I was involved in a discussion about what you're going to be talking about in the coming months this year. So in order to set that discussion going, I'm not going to cite lots of statistics or anything, because you're going to hear the specifics of what's happening in China and Russia, in Latin America, and so on. So I'm going to try and talk in a not too highfalutin way about the theoretical framework of that. Well, that I think is helpful, and I think we should use. So. Why Len? There's, first of all, at the end of the day, we're interested in making political change happen, which is why the final question there, what should be our political response, is perhaps the key one. And I think the war in Ukraine, which began almost a year ago with the Russian invasion, and obviously the roots of it go much further back than that, has enlisted three broad responses from socialists. You have some who take the position that this is an assault on national sovereignty and the right of Ukraine to determine the national determination of Ukraine, and breaking the sort of international law and so on. You have a position that this is essentially a clash of imperialisms, much as Lenin and the Bolsheviks described the First World War as being, and that therefore we should take a defeatist position on all sides. Whether anyone is actually effectively taking a defeatist position is another issue we can perhaps discuss. You have a third position, which is that China in particular, but to some extent Russia, represent the oppressed nations of the world, and that in standing up to the US hegemony, however potentially politically reactionary the leadership of Russia may be, they're effectively playing, they're objectively playing a progressive role to undermine US imperialism. There's another aspect of that is some people describe China as socialist, and I'm going to look at one group in particular that does that and discuss whether that is the case. So I'm kind of treading on ground that we are going to discuss in the coming months when I move on to that. To return to the, so I'll move on to the next slide, which is a, I found this in something someone else was quoting. So as Marxists, we're materialists, and I'm a materialist anyway. So I believe that the way that we, I'm doing what Amanda said I should not do, which is talk over the text of a slide, so you can read the slide. But Marx's most important and most scientific work was Capital, and all the various iterations of that. Volume 1 was the only one he published in his lifetime. He produced various editions of it, so I always refer back to the first volume of Capital first of all, and then the other volumes of Capital. There's some people go for the Grundrisse and so on, but I think what the final version of what Marx produced is what's important. Capital, however, is a scientific work, and as this quote says, we take no account of the export trade by means of which a nation can change articles of luxury, blah, blah, blah. In order to examine the object of our investigation, which is capitalism, in its integrity, free from all disturbing subsidiary circumstances, we must treat the whole world as one nation and assume that capitalist production is established everywhere and has taken possession of every branch of industry. So in Capital, he's dealing with an abstraction which did not actually exist, but he thought this was the best way to uncover what capitalism actually was and its laws of motion as a mode of production. People, I don't particularly go into Hegelianism and all of that, and I don't think it's necessary to understand Capital, because what Marx is doing is actually adopting the scientific method. In all natural sciences, people make a model which is an abstraction from the immense complexity of reality. If you try and understand what every single atom is doing, what every single creature is doing in a biosphere, you're not going to you're not going to see the wood for the trees. So you have to be careful to completely miss out the trees, but it's important that, so it's model making, and the different volumes of Capital are various levels of abstraction. So Capital 1, in terms of its study of capitalism, is the most abstract, although in terms of talking about primitive accumulation and conditions in industry, he does talk about what's really happening there, but in terms of understanding value and the relations between the different categories that he uses, he goes quite a long way from reality, and it's only by volume 3 that he brings in the effects of competition and how prices actually deviate from the values of the commodities which are produced. This isn't a lecture on Marxist political economy, so I won't say anything more than that. Just to point out that if we want to talk about international relations, geopolitical politics, geopolitical conflict, then we have to move we have to understand the relationship between between how economic systems work and how the international systems of states works. And I'm going to argue that that's, to understand the relationship with international states, you go via the relationship of the individual state, and that it's an extension of the relationship between the capitalist class and the bourgeois state is then, and the relationship between different capitals, you get to understand what's happening in the international arena. I'm going to take quite a lot of quotes from Lenin's Imperialism, actually. You know how I outlined the three positions which I've seen socialists adopting. You can actually find support from Lenin for all three of those, because he talked about the rights of nations to national self-determination, he talked about oppressed states and oppressor states, but it's in imperialism that he talks about conflict between great powers and how you get to understand what's happening at the time that he was writing. So colonial policy, and this is a key point, the system of international system of states, geopolitical conflict, goes way back before capitalism came into existence. And territoriality, different territories with different political systems in them, go way back before capitalism was even dreamed of, was anyone could talk about it. So Lenin makes this point that colonial policy and imperialism existed before this latest stage of capitalism, and even before capitalism. Rome, founded on slavery, pursued a colonial policy and practiced imperialism. But general disquisitions on imperialism, which ignore or put into the background the fundamental difference between socio-economic systems, inevitably degenerate into the most vapid banality and bragging, like the comparison Greater Rome and Greater Britain. And he references a book which was written just before the First World War, which was saying that how Britain had achieved the magnificence of ancient Rome. Even the capitalist colonial policy of previous stages of capitalism is essentially different from the colonial policy of finance capital, and his book goes into, we're going to look at that. And this, in terms of the different theoretical ways of understanding the international system, how politics works at an international level, this is a very important distinction to make, because you have world systems theory, people like Wallerstein, Arrighi, and so on, who basically see patterns of recurring rise and fall of hegemons and so on, going back to the 1200s. In the case of Anders Gunder Frank, you have he actually in the end talked about 5,000 years of what he described as a capitalist international system, because you've had money and commercialism and trade and finance going back not 5,000 years, I would argue, but at least 3,000, almost 3,000 years. But if you don't understand what's different about capitalism, you're not going to have a very useful theoretical framework in which to understand things. So the relationship between capital and the geopolitical system actually isn't an obvious one. The capital. So what is capitalism? It's a system based on commodities. As I say, commodities have existed for a long time, but it's in which the production of commodities has become the principal, the main, quite often the only way that things are produced, and that commodity production has become so general that even our ability to work has become a commodity. So it's dependent on the separation of the producers from the means of production. You've had lots of exploitative systems throughout the world which have been based on peasants essentially owning either by customary practice or using the land on which they live. So they have access to the means of production, but extra economic methods are used to extract a surplus from them. Either taxes, people come along, military people or police come along with weapons and extract part of what they produce, or you have feudalism, which is a similar system of extra legal production, but based on serfdom, in which the serf might provide labour services to the lord who has his own lands as well as the peasants' land. So the peasants provide for themselves from the land which they farm, and then they spend a certain amount of the year working for the lord and producing crops which he owns. So the exploitation, the way exploitation happens is quite clear. In terms of capitalism, you have a very strange system, a unique system which has only really existed for a few hundred years, in which the producers apparently get paid for the value of their work, of their labour power. In fact, Marx says they are paid for the value of their labour power, but there's still a surplus which allows the people who employ them to make profits, have rent and interest, have super yachts and live in great mansions, or also reinvest profits so that they can make more profits. So the position I'm taking is close to what the political Marxists say, so that the distinction, so that capitalism can only arise when wage labour has become possible, and that it arose in England starting in the 16th century, when an arrangement took place in which you had landowners, you had farmers who rented the land, piece of land from them, and then you had a peasantry who'd been divorced from the land, who were looking for work, and those farmers employed them to work for them. So this is a key point in terms of the dynamics of economic systems around the world, because the world systems theory argues that that it was the spread of commercialism and trading and so on which prompted that came first, and then capitalist relations were initiated by that. The political Marxists were called political by their opponents, but they accepted that term in the same way that the Big Bang theory of the origins of the universe was first a term of abuse, but now it's used by everyone who believes in it. So the political Marxists argue that it was political struggle between peasants and landowners that led to a unique situation in Britain arising, and that where peasants hold on to the land, even if there's extra economic exploitation of them, it's actually quite difficult for capitalism to arise, and that's a block to the spread of capitalism. That capitalism arose in Britain, and then once Britain became the predominant power, other powers, the same dynamic either happened there, or you had top-down revolutions. Now I see Lenin's approach as being closest to that of the political Marxists in terms of what he's saying here is that capitalism is a very distinct mode of production based on a very distinct means of exploiting the people who actually do the work, the producers, and this produces a dynamic to accumulation between competitive. The exploiters are also dependent on the market, so if they have to accumulate, they can't just consume all of their profits, because otherwise they're going to be outcompeted by other capitalists. So there's an expansionary, accumulatory dynamic, and also a technological, innovatory dynamic to the way that capitalism works, that is unique of all the modes of production that have ever existed to date, is unique, and it produces, as we're going to see, a unique dynamic towards competition between capitals and ultimately competition between nations as well. So the kind of dynamic, geopolitical dynamic that you get in the era of capitalism is driven by different, even if it looks the same, is driven by different forces. Although there's obviously a relationship between them. So we'll just go as quickly as we can through what Lenin said about the phase of capitalism that he lived in, and that he thought was responsible for the obviously horrendous conflict of the First World War. So later on in this, the version I've got here, got in 1970, it's dated 1975. The briefest possible definition of imperialism, the monopoly stage of capitalism. We'll discuss what that actually means. Finance capital is the bank capital of a few very big monopolist banks merged with the capital of the monopolist combines of industrialists. And the division of the world is the transition from a colonial policy which is extended without hindrance to territories unseized by any capitalist power, as happened in the latter part of the 19th century, to a colonial policy of monopolistic possession of the territory of the world, which has been completely divided up. And he then goes on to say, so that's Lenin says is the briefest description. He says if you want a fuller description, this is his conclusion. It involves the concentration of production and capital to such a high stage that it's created monopolies, financial oligarchy, we'll go on to discuss what that is, and the export of capital is distinguished from the export of commodities. Commodities are still being exported, but in the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th century, there was a huge increase of investments going around the world, and the export of capital becomes of exceptional importance for the formation of international monopolist combines which share the world among themselves. 5, the territorial division of the whole world among the biggest capitalist powers has been completed. That, number 5 at least, was definitely the position 100 or so years ago. So so let's go on and look at each of what I've divided things up into a number of categories that. So let's see. So the first one, monopoly capitalism. Capitalism in its imperialist stage leads right up to the most comprehensive socialisation of production. It is, so to speak, drags the capitalists against their will and consciousness into some sort of new social order, a transitional one from complete free competition to complete socialisation. Then elsewhere, the old capitalism, the capitalism in free competition with its indispensable regulator, the stock exchange, is passing away. A new capitalism has come to take its place. Then the obvious features of something transient, a mixture of free competition and monopoly. So this was a common, actually a common idea among lots of economists in the first part of the 20th century, because it was describing the cartels which existed where big companies got together and divided up the market among themselves so that they could avoid competition and make things nice and stable for themselves. Because and then you ended up with a small number of big companies controlling whole industries, and Lenin describes that. Problem with and I think that's a real phenomenon, and obviously to this day you continue to have enormous companies which control whole industries, whole spheres. Even in the newest industries, the technology industries, social media and so on, you have a few companies which divide it up and monopolise it. It did lead to the use of the term monopoly to describe this did lead to, I think, some false theorisation in the course of the 20th century to the effect that there wasn't any competition, that there was effectively one big capitalist or whatsoever. Competition still exists. What you have is rather you have oligopolistic capitalism, I would say, in which you have big companies arise. Sometimes they control things, but they don't survive forever. So Microsoft looks like it's in a fairly dominant position as far as operating systems and that concerns, but you have Apple comes along and has an alternative system. So you do get a position where one company absolutely dominates an industry and can set the terms and can exclude others. All these technology monopolies are accused of behaving the same way that the big companies in the United States at the end of the 19th century, the Rockefellers and who's the guys that have loads of libraries in Scott, Clinton and so on. You have those characters that bow the sort of corporate barons of the end of the 19th century. You have similar situations evolving, but I don't think you can understand, we can discuss this, I don't think you can understand how people then argue, well, there's no competition anymore, in which case most of Marx's categories in his understanding of capitalism, why there's any dynamic to technological innovation at all anyway, would not continue. So that's patently not the case. If companies are still having to look out for rivals and competitors, and technological innovation still is happening. We could discuss whether it's not happening to the extent that it otherwise could. So that's a discussion to be had. Financial oligarchy. So Hilford, there were a bunch of Marxists who were writing about imperialism in the first part of the 19th century. You have Rosa Luxemburg wrote about it, Bukharin wrote about it, and both of them actually had a different position from Lenin on the national right of self-determination, the big arguments. Hilferding was an Austrian Marxist who wrote a book about finance capital. Marx quotes him to say, finance capital is capital controlled by banks and employed by industrialists. The concentration of capital and the growth of bank turnover are radically changing the significance of banks. Scattered capitalists are transformed into a single capitalist. A handful of monopolists subordinate to their will all the operations, both commercial and industrial, of the whole of capitalist society. The supremacy of finance capital over all other forms of capital means the predominance of the rentier, which is an important point actually, and the financial oligarchy. It means the singling out of a small number of financially powerful states from among all the rest. So Lenin is describing a position because banks are lending, are the source of money for lots of companies, and they know quite intimately what their position is, that they're actually controlling them, and that the banks are being put in a prime position as far as capitalism is concerned. That may describe, the thing is, there was a big difference between the way the financial system worked in Germany, which Hilferding was talking about, where banks were very closely involved with companies in terms of drawing up their plans and all of that, with the Anglo-Saxon sphere, for instance, where that was less the case. It's finance is important, and it obviously we're quite a financialized phase of capitalism now, but to me it seems that it's more a question of financial capitalists skimming off the profits which industrialists are making, and I'm not convinced that they're actually dictating to them what they produce and all of this kind of thing. So you have private equity, which in a sense is a form of finance capitalism, which comes in, buys up companies which it sees as underperforming, which shares don't equal the value of what they have, and then they carve them up and sell them off and all of that. So that's kind of it's not a very positive, it's not a particularly progressive role. But finance, some countries, it's true, they have a key financial role. In the United States, obviously, the dollar is the reserve currency of the world, in effect. Most trade takes place in the dollar. That gives the United States enormous power over other countries. Until 1971, was it? It was on the gold standard, and then it came off that. That was seen as a position where the United States was demonstrating its weakness in the post-war world. There's a book by Peter Gowan about the Wall Street, Treasury, Wall Street, Treasury being the central bank of the United States, complex, in which he discusses this, and I think he makes quite a strong case for saying that this actually strengthened the position of the United States versus other countries, because it could decide what level the dollar was going to be, could manipulate the level of the dollar, and thereby discipline its potential competitors and so on. You saw that in the 80s, when there was lots of, as there is now, lots of talk about China overtaking the United States. There was then talk about Japan, which seems less likely since the population of Japan is much smaller than the United States. But there was talk about Japan becoming the hegemonic capitalist power. The United States got Japan into a position where the yen was overvalued, and the economy essentially crashed at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, and it's been in the doldrums ever since, never recovered from that. So you've had, that's more than 3 decades where the Japanese economy has been in a stagflationary position, and you can argue, bourgeois economists tend to talk about what Japan did wrong in terms of the debts of companies and the banks and so on, but the United States, using the dollar had a huge role in making that happen. So that is an example of the key financial nations of the world being able to use, and Britain plays subsidiary to the United States, but obviously has a big financial centre and so on. So Britain has similar power, and if we were to discuss in political economy terms, finance doesn't produce any value to it. It doesn't produce commodities. It's just it's the lubricant for commodity production, like in capital. Well, obviously in capitalism, because a putative future system will not produce commodities; it will produce use values, real things, but where money would not be required. In capitalism, you need money, but according to Marxist understanding of economics, it doesn't produce commodities directly. It just enables them to happen. It's at best a service that it provides to the actual producers of commodities. Therefore, the profits that all the money that finance capital makes is sucked in from the actual productive part of the economy. So to the extent that a national economy specialises in finance, it's sucking in value and surplus value from those economies which are producing real things. So that's a way, in a sense, in which finance capital does exploit other capitalists. So I think that's the correct way to identify it. The export of capital. So here's some more quotes about the importance of the export. I see Amanda's looking at her watch. Lenin saying, so long as capitalism remains, surplus capital will not be utilised. He's thinking about in the big capitalist countries of his time. Surplus capital will be utilised not for the purpose of raising the standard of living of the masses in the given country, for this would mean a decline in profits for the capitalists, but for the purpose of increasing profits by exporting capital abroad to the backward countries. In these backward countries, profits are usually high, for capital is scarce, the price of land is relatively low, wages are low, raw materials are cheap. And another quote, the necessity for exporting capital arises from the fact that in a few countries capitalism has become overripe, and owing to the backward stage of agriculture and the impoverished state of the masses, capital cannot find a field for profitable investment. And third quote, the export of capital affects and greatly accelerates the development of capitalism in those countries to which it is exported. While therefore the export of capital may tend to a certain extent to arrest development in the capital exporting countries, it can only do so by expanding and deepening the further development of capitalism throughout the world. I think people may find that quite an unusual sentence to see in terms of the way we understood imperialism 40 or 50 years ago. Yeah. So I don't think you need to explain the export of capital by saying that there aren't profitable avenues for investments in the domestic countries from which it's been exported. You just have to capitalists are looking to make the biggest profit they can, and there's not and they're in competition with other capitalists. Lots of stuff that gets created never gets sold, or businesses go bust. There's lots of destruction. Capitalism, as well as being creative and so on, destroys lots of things. You see that particularly when there's a slump. But at all, competition is by definition wasteful of resources. So capitalists will, if there was just one if Britain in the 19th century was the only country in the whole world and it had become capitalist, capitalists would still be competing with each other and moving capital around. The reason it gets exported is for the reasons that Lenin says here, that there's higher profits to be made elsewhere. And for those who get there first and invest first, there's a whole lot less competition as well. So capitalists don't like competition, which is why you do get cartels and monopolies and requests to governments to come in and save them and make life easy for them and so on. They want to survive and become as big as they can and make as big profits as they can. Once new countries become available for investment purposes, then of course capital will move anyway. So, and the impoverished state of the masses, I'm not an under-consumptionist. I don't think that capitalism actually needs the high level of wages to provide consumption. I haven't got time to go into that now, but I would definitely, and I don't think that's the reason for crises either. How much longer have I got?
Half an hour.
Another, that's a long time. But it's really, this third quote I think is really interesting because when we understood, when I was growing up in the 60s, I was a very small boy in the 60s, but in the 70s when I first became politically aware, the understanding of the relationship between the major capitalist powers, the imperialist countries, and those of what was called then and still sometimes is the third world or the global south as it's often called now, was seen as one where capitalism, imperialism generated underdevelopment in countries. And so therefore in the last 40 or 50 years when there's been lots of what we used to be called newly industrializing countries, that's seen as a trend which cuts against imperialist exploitation. But in fact, Lenin in 1916 was predicting that you would actually get, as a result of imperialists exporting capital to Asia and eventually Africa and so on, you would get the development of industry and so on in those countries, but that the big capitalist corporations and capitalist countries would be extracting this because it was foreign companies doing it, they would be extracting surplus value from that, and that's why the rent, when he was talking about finance capital playing a rentier role, that is not only because they're extracting value, because that's what finance capital does, but also because they're setting up industries elsewhere, and then the surplus value, the profits, don't stay there, they come back and then they may be reinvested there, but that's up to them. I'm going to come on because I'm going to talk about that a bit later. Lenin doesn't make this absolutely, this point about the fusion of the state and capital. Before I read the quote, let me just say that 100% clear, but it's obviously implied in what he's writing, and David Harvey, in the book he wrote about imperialism 20 odd years ago, almost 20 years ago, describes the imperialism as being the merging of the economic impulse of capital with the impulse of territoriality. So this I think is key to the link between the dynamic, the logic of capital and geopolitics, which is that capital requires a state. So, I mean, it emerged, capitalism emerged, and individual capitals emerged into a system of not necessarily nation states, but there were states, and then as the dynamic of capitalism turned them into creative. You can argue the toss about this, but I think it's that nationalism, the way we understand states now, is a capitalist phenomenon predominantly, and that and not a feudal phenomenon. But feudalism did create the territoriality which capitalism inherited, and and capital needs a system of laws. You can't really operate a viable system of capitalism in the Wild West, where there are no laws, where the where capitalists have to have their own private armies and defend themselves from people who want to come and rip them off and so on. They want a law and order, and they want a legal system which provides them with stability as far as their property rights are concerned and so on. But they also increasingly want a state which sticks up for them and defends them against capitals in other countries, and and in the 20th century, as we saw, will actually invest in them and provide them with credit and guarantees for trade and all of this. So there's a whole wealth of activities which the state performs for capital, which capitalists want it to perform. And when you get big capitalists merging with powerful states, those states defending the interests of their own capitalists, that's when you get the kind of imperialism which Lenin is describing in the late 19th century and in through the 20th century. Lenin doesn't actually make all those links absolutely clear, but it's obvious that's what he's describing. So in this quote, the capitalists divide the world, and then the capitalist nations divided the non-capitalist world, if you like, between themselves. So the capitalists divide the world not out of any particular malice, but because the degree of concentration which has been reached forces them to adopt this method in order to obtain profits. The question as to whether these changes are purely economic or non-economic, i.e. military, e.g. military, is a secondary one, which cannot in the least affect the fundamental views on the latest epoch of capitalism. To substitute the question of the form of the struggle and agreements, today peaceful, tomorrow warlike, the next day warlike again, for the question of the substance of the struggle and agreements between capitalist combines is the role of a sophist. He's here having a go at Kautsky, to be honest. So we'll come on to that. And then in terms of the territorial division of the world among the biggest capitalists, completely divided up. There's no unowned part of the world, so any future redivision involves a struggle to divide up territory that already has an owner, either colonial territory, or in the case of Germany in the 20th century, saw its natural realm where it could expand as being to the east. It's beyond doubt, therefore, and this is the key point, that capitalism's transition to the stage of monopoly capitalism, or oligopolistic capitalism, if you want to be absolutely precise, and the role that finance capital plays, even if it's slightly different from one that Lenin describes, is connected with the intensification of the struggle for the partition of the world. The principal feature of the latest stage of capitalism is the domination of monopolist combines of the big capitalists. Colonial possession alone gives them monopolies complete guarantee against all contingency in the struggle with competitors. So direct colonies are an extra economic way of guaranteeing profits and profitable accumulation. It's not purely economic. So you've got the military occupation of territories, favouring your own capitalists, keeping out other capitalists, fighting wars against other capitalists, other nations in order to defeat other capitalists, is, if you like, extra economic dynamic. But then territoriality, as opposed to the logic of capital, is kind of extra economic. Ellen Myskins-Woods, in her book on imperialism, describes the US imperialism of the post-Second World War era, which wasn't based generally on colonies, as being the most purely economic imperialism, most purely capitalist imperialism, because it was based to a smaller extent on extra economic use of force to impose itself than the British hegemony. We can discuss that perhaps, because obviously the United States does have very powerful extra economic forces at its disposal, military forces, bases all around the world, even though it's not got colonies on the whole. It's got bases post-Second World War, it's got bases all around the Pacific, all around China, and it would like to have bases in Africa actually. It hasn't got much in the way of bases in Africa, and there's sort of discussion about that. And it had Panama and so on, which was pretty much a direct colony for a long period of time. But particularly in the Pacific and in Europe, of course, post-Second World War, in this country, lots of US military bases. So the US does deploy enormous extra economic power as well as financial power, and the third string to the bow of American hegemony, US hegemony, I would argue, is it wants to maintain a monopoly, if you like, of the most technologically advanced industries. So in aerospace and so on. So this is a source of the conflict with China, with with microchips and so on. There's a huge contest about to happen about who controls the most advanced microchips, and the US is actually passed laws to make it to try and stop companies wherever they are in the world from selling the most advanced microchips to China. That's a use of extra economic power, not purely economic power. So there is the 20th century, the capitalism of the 20th century was a strange amalgam of the dynamic, the logic of capital, which still persists, despite some Marxist argument that it doesn't really, with the dynamic of territoriality, which is by definition extra economic. I'll cut on. This is quite prescient in terms of oppressor and exploited nations. So obviously in 1916 a large part of the world with direct colonies, militarily occupied, as I said, no political or democratic or human rights applying to the peoples in those countries, and there's no question of who was the oppressor and who was the oppressed in those circumstances. Lenin used the term semi-colonies to describe countries such as China, Persia, Iran now, and Turkey, as countries which imperialists, even though they didn't directly occupy them, although it's quite a lot of its important parts of China were occupied, had them so firmly under their thumb, using economic, financial, and military means, that they were effectively colonies. And then he describes diverse forms of dependent countries which are officially politically independent, but in fact are enmeshed in the net of financial and diplomatic dependence. this is as well in addition to the semi-colonies. So Argentina, which very financially dependent on Britain, was effectively a British commercial economy. And interestingly, Portugal, which obviously had an empire of its own at that time, you're saying since the War of Spanish Succession has been effectively a British protectorate. Britain receives commercial privileges and preferential treatment in Portugal and its colonies. So that's, and relations of this kind have always existed between colonial states, but in the epoch of capitalist imperialism, they become a general system, they form part of the sum total of divide the world relations, become linked in the chains of operations of world finance capital. So this is, Portugal's an interesting example where it was itself an imperialist country, but was subjugated by a more powerful country. So you now get lots of countries which behave in ways which would match the description of imperialism that Lenin is describing. Malaysia, for instance, sells cars to Britain, exports, sets up companies. So you have lots of cross export of capital happening all the time. You've got Turkey is trying to have a role in Africa and so on, as well as in its near neighbourhood and exporting capital. You can describe that as potentially imperialist behaviour, but in the same way that Portugal was an imperialist nation. But if there's actually much bigger powers that sort of can roll them in and tell them what to do, then there's still a hierarchy of nation states. I should cut on, I'll leave that one. So these are the three socialist responses to the Ukraine crisis. So the invasion of Ukraine is an attack on national sovereignty, the right of self-determination and rules-based international system. Russia needs to be defeated, and we support providing military equipment and financial aid to Ukraine and sanctioning and isolating Russia. I'm not saying this is my position, but this is a position that some socialists and self-described Marxists have adopted, including quite a lot of what people call the Fourth International. So some of the what was the International Marxist Group, Mandel and so on, quite a lot of them have adopted this position. I'll go straight to number 3. China is a third world developing country blazing a trail for the rest of the global south, and or a socialist country. The route to a more equitable distribution of power globally and a socialist future is via the defeat of the United States and the achievement of a multilateral international order. We support, in effect, Russia and all other countries challenging the US against the US and NATO in the case of the war in Ukraine. The group is another faction of the old IMG, is the group that pursues this line most strong, the strongest version of this line. That's socialist action. I'm going to look at a bit of their position later on. Well, I can't be too much later on. And then there's Lenin's position in the First World War, that it's a conflict between imperialist nations. Socialists should have nothing to do with supporting either side. The role of socialists is to agitate among their working class and organise their working class, defeat their own ruling class, and launch a socialist revolution. And that the way to do that, and that you don't have anything to do with the nationalism of your own side, which I think is a good position to take, and you call for you actually work for the defeat of your own side. And post First World War, those countries which were defeated were the ones which had which the most revolutionary situations developed. Russia, obviously, and Germany, and so on. I should probably wrap up quite soon. That Kautsky ultra-imperial, I'm running out of time, aren't I? So there's the whole ultra-imperialism. If I just go quickly through this. I won't read out the quotes. Don't bother looking at them, Amanda. Kautsky Karl Kautsky was the leading theoretician of the Social Democratic Party and the Second International from 1889 to 1914. He was Lenin and stuff he wrote before 1914 was very admiring of Kautsky and saw him as the leading, the Pope of Marxism. He was sometimes described that, not particularly apposite term. But in 1914, prior to 1914, the Social International had passed resolutions at the international conferences saying that it was obvious that there was potential for a European war to break out, that if that happened, they would assert international working class solidarity, refuse to support their own side, call a general strike, and all of this. When war did break out, virtually all of them, apart from Bolsheviks in Russia, capitulated, supported their own side, and so the Socialist International collapsed in effect because the constituent parts were supporting wars against their own nations. Kautsky took a sort of, in the German Congress, I think only Karl Liebknecht voted against, there was a vote of war credits to the German government. I think only Karl Liebknecht voted against. Karl Kautsky took a position that you should abstain on it. So this is throughout. Lenin's always accusing Kautsky of being mealy-mouthed about the position that he adopted, and he sees that as almost worse than the out-and-out social imperialists, as he would describe the socialists who became cheerleaders for the imperialism of their own nation. Someone who can't take a clear, strong position. If the only way to oppose this socialist imperialism is to be absolutely resolutely opposed to it and adopt a position that you will in no way whatsoever support the military efforts of your own side. Kautsky tried to have his cake and eat it, set on the fence and so on, and Lenin broke with him politically completely and called him and said he was an ex-Marxist and all of this. Where it talked about in the days when Kautsky used to be a Marxist, he would say this, that, and the other. Now he says something very different from that. So when the test came, most of European social democracy failed the test. Kautsky was saying, so what Kautsky was saying was that imperialism is a policy of the nation. So he de-linked imperialism from capitalism, if you like. He said it's quite possible for a capitalist nation to not be imperialist, and in fact it would be cheaper for them if they just traded economically. They'd make more profits. They wouldn't waste money on holding down nations and holding down colonies, and that it's possible in the future that the big imperialist powers will form a cartel to exploit the agrarian areas of the world, and that he called this ultra-imperialism, sometimes super-imperialism. We can discuss whether there actually was an element of ultra-imperialism about what happened, and Lenin actually doesn't deny that that could happen, but he says at this time when there's such huge differences in the level of development of capitalist countries, conflict is obviously happening. We've got the slaughters happening on the battlefields of Europe and around the world to hold out the possibility of a peaceful imperialism in the future is in effect to try and hold out a sop and saying we don't have to be like this. It's sort of pacifist position rather than a resolutely anti-capitalist position. So this, I'll finish with this, which is the position of socialist action, which is the group which takes the most, that third position of supporting China. Anyway, they produced, in alliance with other people, a pamphlet called Pluripolarity to Socialism, a manifesto. Pluripolarity being another term for multipolarity, which was coined by Hugo Chavez. So anyway, we can discuss this. I think I should kind of wrap up. But their position is, there's aspects of it which are an accurate description of how the world works, but what I think is highly problematic is their description of China as it is now, as socialist. And I think they this document refers to a number of things that Engels said and Marx said. It doesn't say where they come from, so you can't directly look them up for themselves. I did look them up and found out where they came from. And then neither Engels nor Marx is saying the thing that this manifesto is purporting that they said. They're talking about something else quite differently. So I think there's disingenuousness about describing what Marx said socialism was. I don't think China, people are obviously free to differ with me. I don't see how China can on earth be described as social, or having a socialist economy if it consists of big private corporations competing with each other, exporting capital around the world, even state corporations which are run like private corporations, profit-making things, competing, producing commodities, selling them around the world. There's a property market, there's a stock exchange, there's a property market which works just like our property market is. You've got huge property companies in China which have massive debts and are only surviving because the government instructs the banks to not to make them go bust. So you do have a very strong role of the state, but how does that differ from the role of the state which Lenin describes a monopoly capitalism as having? It's a different model to what you have in the United States and Britain. It's not a very different model from what you have in South Korea, or what you to some extent have in Japan, what you have in Taiwan and so on. There's an East Asian model of capitalism which the state plays a big role, and it had to, because it's only, and maybe I'll conclude with this, you're only going to get the development of modern forms of, or capitalist industrialization and modern forms of capitalism, where you have a state which can play a role that defends its own capitalism and can stand up to some extent against the major powers, especially the United States. Although it has to be said, all the countries which have developed in East Asia have, in the case of South Korea and Taiwan and so on, a very close relationship with the United States anyway, and the United States allows them to do it, or have had a very close relationship with the United States, as China had. After Nixon went to Beijing, the Chinese effectively became an ally of the United States against the Soviet Union, and after they moved towards a so-called market economy, US investment flooded in and so on. And it's only in the last few years that the United States has started getting jumpy about this. So that's my, and this is just a quote from the critique of the Goethe program, which is often abused to describe market socialism, so-called as socialism. That's not what the first phase of communist society. I've heard John Ross, who's the theoretical leader of the socialist action, in a seminar on China, describe China, the Chinese economy, is effectively an equivalent of what Marx described as the first phase of communism. This is what it describes the first phase of communism as: a cooperative society based on common ownership of the means of production, no private company, everything is socially owned, within which the producers do not exchange their products. There's no commodity production or commodity exchange. Just as little does the labour employed on the products appear here as the value of these products. You don't have the law of value, doesn't apply.
No market.
There's no market, there's no law of value. There's a material quality possessed by them, since now, in contrast to capitalist society, individual labour no longer exists in an indirect fashion, i.e. through the market. So you don't actually know what contribution any individual person, worker, company has made. It's all behind the veil of the market, so you can't see that the financial sector isn't producing anything worthwhile, that it's actually having to extract value and surplus value from elsewhere. You can't see that because of the way the market works. But in the first phase of communism, as Marx describes it, you will know what everyone is producing, what everyone's contribution is, because it's planned. So even though he talks about labour vouchers and so on, they're not money, and he explicitly says that. So how someone of John Ross's eminence and could have the gall to describe China as equivalent to this absolutely beats me. So I'll end with that. I've gone on for far too long. Thank you.
About this seminar.
Nick, on one of your opening slides, you mentioned something, I think, about the predictive ability of the theory and whether it was still working for us in a sense. I'd like to see if we can argue around that point in relation to Ukraine, for instance, and the conflict that arose between US mainly and NATO and the Soviet Union. There is at least one theory that anticipated that many years ago, and that was John Mearsheimer and his structural realist position. His position was based that the conflict was between states, and through there he could go and analyze how the struggle for hegemony had moved to between the United States and China, and the Soviet Union was just a secondary aspect of the struggle, but that the main one and the future war would take place between the United States and China. And he also foresaw what happened in the Caucasus, for instance. Can you come back to analyzing the situation from a capital point of view into a capital rivalry? And why would this US and NATO have to confront and take on the Soviet Union when Russia, of course, well, it could very easily integrate it into a capitalist world structure. So what part of our theory, our analysis, can explain what's happening in there, if not relying on a state analysis? The fact that the main conflict of our era is taking between states, and the states, especially the major states, objective to become hegemonious, not only in their part of the world, but globally.
Maybe I should take, I've spoken quite a lot, so it may be that others, I'll come back to that though.
Yeah, I've got a few comments actually. I think I'd like to start with this Kautsky position of ultra-imperialism. This actually had a revival in the early 90s with a book that was very, very famous at the time, written by a couple of guys called Antonio Negri was one of them. Who was the other one? Hart. Hart and Negri, which basically, they were against capitalism, but what they were saying as well, basically following the fall of the Soviet Union, basically we were going to go into this kind of Kautskyite global situation in which the conflicts would be fought out peacefully and purely economically, etc., etc. Which of course didn't last very long in terms of, you very soon had the war against Yugoslavia, you had all the attacks on Iraq, etc., etc. But for a period following the end of World War II, you did have a situation where the big capitalist imperialist powers were not at war with each other, because the US had become so dominant and was able to, impose its will through things like turning on and off the tap of technology, for example, but also the threat of communism, the position of the Soviet Union, and the movement by third world countries led by the Soviet Union and communists that threatened imperialism. So there was the domination of the USA and all those threats that led to them being kind of willing to all be under that US control and umbrella. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how long that lasts following the end of the USSR. So the situation in Ukraine is quite interesting because it has actually, at least superficially, cemented that bloc, that post-Cold War NATO plus Japan, Australia and New Zealand, basically, as a bloc. But they appear to have had a lot less success in mobilising third world countries against Russia. And China, of course, in the background. Very interesting development is the military exercises, the military naval exercises taking place off the coast of South Africa, between South Africa, China and Russia, which has the United States and Western powers very, very concerned. On a couple of technical things, so the issue of underdevelopment or acceleration and what happened in Japan. The export of capital has been accompanied, at least in the period after countries managed to achieve technical political independence from the colonial powers, has been accompanied by control of the technology and hoarding of the technology. Therefore you get the export of capital and companies investing or setting up business in other countries, but it doesn't result in a general improvement in the level of technology in that country. So, Mexico being a good example of that. China's model, I think, has threatened that, because what the Chinese have done is made investment conditional on you have to hand over the plans of the technology. And even if you don't agree with that, we will get our hands on them. And that is something that, along with the role of China as a kind of an alternative pole, if you want investment, you can go to China for your investment. You don't have to go to the USA, Britain, France, etc. And China doesn't impose those political conditions on you. That, I think, is one of the factors that is leading to the kind of breakdown of the unipolar world, if you like. Regarding China being socialist, I think Nick is absolutely right on this. China isn't socialist, then there do appear to be measures in which China is moving away from the kind of pure neoliberal model and increasing the role of the state. But that is not resulting in the end of the market or planning, etc.
I have recently looked through what Marx wrote about world market. As far as I understood, he says that capital requires world market, creates world market, whatever it does. Now, today we have also a phenomenon which is being taught in the universities as well, supply chains. Supply chain is a capitalist structure which goes over maybe 100 states, maybe 5 states. It is trans-state. So, my question is this. You said somewhere that capitalism requires a state. Well, capitalism required a state and used state which is preceding capitalism. But I think state is not an inevitable part of capitalism, state as we know. Capitalism's main organization is a corporation, and supply chain strengthens the hand of corporation rather than the national state. So we have actually many conflicts in the micro level, regional, global, everywhere states are involved. As far as I understand, the age of states, national states, is just passing. We also see that in the situations where America loses quite a bit of actual sovereignty over the world market. There are other factors, not necessarily states. What do you say about that?
Any other questions or contribution? Otherwise, me.
Okay. If I answer them kind of in reverse order, it might be good. So you've shown me that quote. So Marx is saying quite late on in a letter in correspondence with someone that a capitalist world market is emerging for the first time now with sort of with San Francisco and Australia. And
Letter to Engels, 1858. How far?
That late? Okay, mid 19th century now. So that's a capitalist world market. That's sort of anyway. Is the state becoming less important now? The United States is a state. Seems quite a powerful state to me. Some states are more powerful than other states, obviously. So, and states, most, I'm not sort of interested, as I was saying, because of my family background with what happened in Africa, and we went to Ghana in 2018, and that's a different, and the state there is not particularly strong. I mean, it's got political stability in Ghana, so what happens, it would be wrong to just apply a stereotype to every country in Africa. Ghana is very, you feel quite safe, and people generally, there's not starvation and that kind of thing. But people, workers are very lowly paid, and there's a huge informal economy. People who aren't official, and that's the thing we perhaps talk about. Very high levels of urbanisation. So in lots of countries you have very high levels of urbanisation, but not necessarily of proletarianisation, if you like. There's an informal economy where people are playing a bit of a petty, well, definitely a petty bourgeois role there, and trying to duck in and diving, and that's the petty bourgeoisie issue of the 21st century. Is as much an urban one as it is the peasantry, say, as it was at the time of the Russian Revolution. That's a diversion. So capitalists who don't have a strong state don't do as well as those capitalists who do have a strong state, backing them up. And perhaps to come to the question about what's the dynamic between why are the United States and Russia, for instance, in rivalry. And it is quite bizarre. You'd think, because, right, I think it's because of the role that the United States and US advisors played in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The economic policies which were imposed were not to the benefit of there wasn't, at the point of the collapse of the Soviet Union, there wasn't Russian capital, but what those who wanted to become Russian capitalists generally had a very hard time with it. Well, everyone in Russia had a hard time with it. As we know, the life expectancy fell very sharply. There was absolute economic catastrophe in Russia, and a few oligarchs emerged from the privatizations and so on with enormous wealth. I think the Putin regime, Putin came in, that's a context in which he came to power almost, well, perhaps it's 20 years ago now, in terms of a collapsed Russian economy in which Russia was just being walked all over by Western powers, and he's incrementally built up, re-established the power of the Russian state over the economy, over society, and so on, in terms of putting the oligarchs in their place. And they can still carry on being billionaires and so on, but as long as they serve, they don't run against him politically, and they serve his interests. So it's not nowhere near a socialist society, but it's a peculiar form of capitalism. And I think there's been, because of that experience, they don't see, it's difficult for them to, I mean, on what basis, and there's lots of foreign companies own, there's been quite a lot of investments of foreign companies and so on. And on this site that I was complaining about, the Socialist Action Site, in effect, the International Manifesto Group, they've got a speech by the leader of the Russian Communist Party, Gennady Zyuganin, which, what's his name, you say? Gennady Zyuganov, who talks about the one of the things is about the amount of Russian industry that's owned by foreign capital. It says 65% of Russian industry is owned by foreign capital, 90% of trade is owned by foreign networks. Foreigners own 76% of railway engineering, and 77% of non-ferrous metallurgy. So,
what year was that?
That's 2020. So this year or last year gave the speech, but last year, I guess. So, and the economy is less than 2% of the world total, while China's is 16%. So seems to me there is a clash of economic interests between the United States and Russia. Obviously, geopolitical conflict is geopolitical conflict. So, I mean, I don't believe in a simplistic relationship between base and superstructure. So, not everything is done for economic reasons. And lots of people argued at the time of the Afghan or Iraq war that the reason the United States was doing that was for purely either to get the oil, which would make more sense, or for reasons of providing outlets for the US military industry. People always come up with very economic justifications for why it happened. There are geopolitical. The United States is not going to undermine its own geopolitical position by entering a war it doesn't think it's going to win, because it's going to create more demand for its military industries and so on. It didn't win either. Ultimately, it's not won either of those wars, Afghanistan or Iraq, but it wasn't their intention to go in there and lose. There were geopolitical reasons in terms of rivalries with other states and trying to gain control of a region which is important for economic reasons because of the oil it produces, but not a simple sort of so that only American companies are going to get the oil. It's as much to control a region which other countries were more, China's more dependent on Middle East oil than it was then than the United States is, and probably is even more now because the United States is even less dependent. So I think there is a complex relationship, you're right, between the economic impulses and the geopolitical impulses, and you shouldn't draw a simplistic relationship between the two by any means. Geopolitics is its own realm, and politics is its own realm, and there's a degree of independence, and there's feedback as well from one to the other. We obviously believe that as socialists, because we believe that by seizing political power, we can transform the economy from one mode of production to another. So we think ultimately the political realm can assert its supremacy over the political realm at that point. Although the point I'm also making is if you create a capitalist economy, if you have a socialist revolution that creates a capitalist economy, that economy is going to have its own dynamic. You're going to have capitalists who are going to want to invest, who are going to have influence, whose class interests are going to be represented at the highest echelons of the state, which is the case in China. So many Communist Party leaders have, even if they keep quiet about their own investments and wealth, they have relatives who have taken advantage of the opening up in China to make lots of money.
But then it doesn't make sense to talk about socialist revolution. It's rubbish. Because what you have done is a political revolution, correct. But at the end of it, socialism does not come. Capitalism under control of Communist Party or allies becomes the reality.
Absolutely correct, yeah.
Yeah, we have this discussion always between different political factions in Turkey. Some people say we need socialist revolution. The others says, well, national democratic revolution like the Chinese, or advanced people's democratic revolution, more or less. They say the same thing. There will be capitalism because you can't escape it. That's the given factor, and you are going to control it. You are going to intervene into life so that the whole society goes towards communism. That is the theory, anyway.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, and you talk about difference between comprador bourgeoisie and the national bourgeoisie and all this kind of thing. So the idea of making an alliance between the working class and the national bourgeoisie, which might have had made some sense at a time in a colony where no one has state power, none of the local classes have state power as an external force. and you're fighting against that, you're going to make temporary alliances with whoever you need to make to fight that. But once there's a state power, then a class is going to predominate in terms of who controls that state. So then it doesn't work in
Maybe you won't believe me, but Zhuganov's party programmatically defends national democratic revolution in Russia.
Indra?
Actually, every phenomena has multi-dimension, and I agree with the geopolitical position and everything, as you said as well. But at the ultimate position, you can link the what's happening in the economic situation, and the other sort of structures are coming into being. This is a question, I mean, you asked, and I want to contribute to that. For me, to sort of think about the state is very important. I always ask a question, hey, is the chicken comes from the egg or the egg from the chicken? For me, I think the law is the prominent and the first phenomenon that we need to look at. Because state means is law, both for making it as well as implementing it. Forget about the executive, because they are day-to-day basis. The ministries are implementing whatever is ready for them to do. However, let's say Westminster or any ministries coming together and discussing about what law needs to be passed and how to implement is the jurisprudence that they do. So when I look at it historically, 1973 or etc. onwards, people start to say, we are living in an atom age. Why we look at the law, which is meticulously cutting the small piece into million of pieces, it's a waste of time. And then the 24 hours time, the Assembly, the Parliament was making very quick laws. No one has any idea when the people are affected. They do them on the point that they are doing something. What happened? Law is changed. So laws start to become very weak in terms of, but it doesn't mean the state was becoming weak. We need to look at it, why the laws start to be more amorph, instead being like in the free capitalist era. It was very meticulous because people who were trading, they didn't want to be cheated. They want to be put their back to the law, and then law will support their money that it will not be wasted. But now when you look at it, it is more amorph in terms of the wording as well as implementing. Today they applaud you and they say you are a great man, you are a peacemaker, blah blah blah, and then 10 years after, the same man is tried and put into prison. I see that, I mean, in the practice, in Turkey and here and there. So the same man, maybe the same people, tried guys in the trial and put into prison. So it means with the same wording, because wording is so soft, you can interpret in this way or that way. It seemed to me that new liberal economy is a kind of came into being because capitalism was in difficulty. The rate of profit was coming down, one way or another. They were in danger. So the deregulation was very important to get out whatever is in the liberal time given to the mass of people taken away. How can you take it away without the proper, strong state? Because law is made available in terms of what I am describing possible. No one will say, hey, look, what law writes, because it is already softened. But the state needs to be very strong. It says, no, it doesn't say that. It does say this. And this is getting more and more. And I state this, states are getting more brutal, more what we call it right-wing, and fascistic or whatever, because they need it. They need it to control the masses. Masses can be uncontrollable otherwise, because you are taking their air to breathe in and out. You are not giving them a proper water. You are not providing a proper soil. You are giving a GMO production kind of wheat, whatever. Soya renew, the food is becoming important. Animals are dying. Human beings are dying. So many issues in your hand. And you are just producing and producing, which is quantity, not quality. So that requires a very strong state. Very strong state. Will kill you, will bring more tanks to come to you, to stop you, blah, blah. I think we need to think about that.
Yes, and then
I just want to say one thing. Actually, this is what capitalism is looking for. In my opinion, capitalism is looking for flexibility in laws and regulations in each country. Flexibility should be the keyword here. Because they assume that the system itself assumes that they're going to become more sustainable in the future. So the question here is, how can we protect our laws against white capitalism at this stage? Then we can start maybe discussing more deeply in order to make a sustainable socialist idea to fight with capitalism. This is my opinion.
I was just thinking about world market. World market has requirements. I interpret whatever they called Arabian Spring, all from North Africa, all Islamic countries, and then Erdogan in Turkey, and Modi in India, even the Chinese revival, all of them actually are sort of response to the requirements of world market, world capitalism. They are, world market requires that all the infrastructure should be in harmony with the superstructure. So superstructures must change. That's what they are doing everywhere. And maybe we can try to understand, when the British has gone into India with East India Company, what did they do? They found a society which did not suit their requirements. So they created their own laws, or they have created their own colonial governments which tried to fit the Indian law into capitalist needs. That is what world market is doing now. Everywhere it is the same. What people are calling neoliberalism is actually trying to answer the requirements of world market capitalism. There is only one system, which is capitalism. China, Russia, Cuba, or whatever you call. Everybody operates within the same ocean of capitalism. What do you think about that?
how long you got?
20 minutes.
20 minutes.
10 minutes.
What do I think about it?
Going off of your point as well, I think it's kind of interesting to look at kind of like the global south and how we have all these kind of economies that haven't fully developed in the kind of same way because they've been stifled by the West. And I guess I'm asking because they haven't kind of reached their full capitalistic potential, and also kind of looking at how they've been stifled by debt to the West, and you know, organisations like the IMF have kind of like put them in a chokehold. How does kind of like development in a kind of post-colonial, well, I guess informal colonial economic sense work in the global south? Like how can we ensure like the global south develops and doesn't follow the footsteps of capitalism in the West, and kind of like follow the more sustainable kind of developmental path that isn't kind of stifled by the debt and yeah, I guess.
That's a really important point. I'll finish off with that though, on neoliberalism, because this is relevant to that question as well. What was neoliberalism? Because ostensibly that was a withdrawal of the state from a large part of the role that it had hitherto played. But so that was seen by lots of people as being a reduction in the role of the power of the state, increasing power of corporations and capital, and so on. But it was a very first of all, the period between 1945 and 1979, say, or mid-1970s, when monetarism in this country and cuts from that started to happen under the Callahan government. As far as Britain's concerned, similar timescale in the US. It was designed to. Well, it was for two. It was because it was the class struggle in drawn tooth, because you'd had 30 years where working class demands had been. I think part of the post-war settlement was a concession to the working class, because the working class A had become more powerful. B, you had the Soviet Union in existence, which presented a non-capitalist alternative, and whatever you think of that, people were talking in terms of we can have an alternative to capitalism. So capitalism had to deliver some of the things the Soviet Union was seen as developing: welfare, full employment, this kind of thing. But the working class became very powerful as a result of that, and in the 70s, a tremendous period of class struggle, wasn't it, with the 1972 Industrial Relations Act, and the workers didn't then, as they do now, just sort of sit around and complain about it. They actually defied it and took action against it, and Heath had to back down on that. That's so. As far as the capitalist class was concerned, something had to be done about the working class, and neoliberalism, privatisation, and withdrawal of support for industries and that, and the anti-trade union laws and everything were to do what they've actually achieved, which is to weaken the working class. But neoliberalism was a policy pursued by the leading capitalist powers. So it was also an imperialist policy, and if you see it in an international context, it was all about doing what you described as undermining the ability of states in the global south to actually intervene and ensure the development of particular industries and all of that. So they wanted to open up markets, withdraw unstop countries from supporting their own industries, which is the only way a country can actually develop itself. It's the way it's done in East Asia and so on. So what East Asia has done wasn't allowed to African countries that had the ambition to do that. Neoliberalism was part of a strategy to undermine that. So you do get the development of underdevelopment. So some economies are denied capitalist development, if you like, and you end up with a huge proportion of the population not participating fully in any kind of commercial activity or paid labour that provides a decent living. It's absolutely, and I'm not aware of any studies which look into what's actually entailed there, because I bet there's people who are making all these informal activities. I bet there's some people who are making money out of that, a lot more money out of that than those you see on the streets, ducking and diving and selling stuff and all of that. But I'm not aware of any study of that. There must be some. In terms of, so that's what neoliberalism is about. So I think, and its role was to do what you described as far as the global south is concerned. There are other countries which have had a large measure in the global south, have had a large measure of industrialisation, especially in Asia. And there, initially at least, there was still, you still had a situation where most of the value from that manufacturing ended up in the West, so to speak, because they were doing assembly line work. Things were brought in there, used low, and this happened in China as well, low paid workers who assembled the imports, and then they were exported to the West. And if you look at where most of the profits were being made, if you divide the cost of the final commodity up, most of the value is being made in the West, even with something, especially with something like an iPhone, say. So Apple doesn't even own the companies which are manufacturing its products. It's just a brand. It owns the brand and it sells them, but a huge proportion of the value of every iPhone is not staying in China with either Foxconn, isn't it, that manufactures iPhones? So it's the company in China isn't making it's making some money, but most of it's being made by Apple or retailers in the United States. That's an exploitative, economically exploitative relationship. So even industrialization, what China is obviously doing now is trying to overcome that. So it's building up national champions like Huawei. The United States doesn't like that. So I mean, that's straight economic competition. The United States doesn't like a Chinese company it has the most advanced 5G technology. The United States doesn't want that. It is determined to use extra economic methods to prevent a Chinese company from outcompeting its own companies. So that's straight competition between American companies and Chinese companies. America's using extra economic means. I mean, extra economic means end up potentially in war. I mean, Taiwan is obviously a big is where it's going to happen. What's in Taiwan? There's a Taiwanese company which makes the majority of the high-spec microprocessors that the United States is forbidding anyone from selling to China. So I mean, that's huge incentive for China to actually unify its territory, as it would see it.
I think you've got to
got to finish.
Can I just make one very brief comment about the point about debt? In the final analysis, the debt of third world countries is about control of technology. Why do they go into debt? Because purely from their own resources, without that advanced production knowledge, okay, they can't develop. Okay, the US isn't giving them the technology free. They buy it at exploitative prices, and then they have to export cheaply to get into Western markets. And if they don't manage to do that, that's when they get into serious debt.
Yeah. Okay. I think the peaceful times in the capitalist system is for capitalist countries preparing the wars. So I think we need to expose them to our contacts, and we need to stop if we can. Otherwise, the world is going somewhere very upside down.
Okay.
And because of the control of the economic and power. So, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
And our next seminar at the last Friday of February.
We shall continue more or less the same discussions over and over again.
That's right.